All right, so we are going to start our new section, which will revolve around the presidency of JFK and Lyndon Baines Johnson. Now, a lot of this information is going to overlap with the last section, which was the civil rights, and it's also going to kind of go into the next section after this, which is pretty much Vietnam. So, a lot of this will be overlapping. I'm going to do my best not to repeat myself so many times, but if a point is key, I will go back over it again and again. JFK's background is very simple. He was a World War II veteran, and his time in World War II taught him a couple of valuable lessons. Him being in the Navy, he fought against the Japanese. And one thing he could not understand about the Japanese was their inability to surrender. And he eventually figured out over time it doesn't matter what you do, doesn't matter how hard you try. Some people just cannot be reasoned with, they're set in their ways, and he's going to carry that in to his political career as well. Now, he will write a book about his times in the war known as the Profiles of Courage, and he did receive the Navy and Marine Corps Medal, which is a pretty high medal for doing an act of heroism in a non combatant time. And that's really going to help him propel into his political career where he will become a senator. And many historians have him ranked as a top five all time senator in his works and getting things done, his ability to go out there and captivate people, motivate them, and so on and so forth. Now, he also did suffer from a lot of back pains growing up. One way he always dealt with that was by taking some kind of amphetamine or some kind of pill to kind of pep him up, get him going, so he can make it through the day. He grew up not the healthiest child. He would make a joke that mosquitoes were afraid to bite him. They would ingest that unhealthy blood and wind up dying in the process. He also did suffer from Addison's disease, which you can see in his eyes are kind of like sunk in his head. This also caused him to look like he was a very tan person, but in reality, it was the disease that was attacking his adrenal glands and things like that that really gave him a lot of problems growing up and even in his adulthood. He had doctors working on him all the time. I mean, he had constant diarrhea sometimes. I mean, the guy had a list full of problems. And some of the problems, other than the medical problems, he kind of brought on himself. Now, probably have heard about his affairs with people like Marilyn Monroe and other people. This is one thing that his wife often had to overlook. Now, he will become the youngest president ever elected, and he is also the first Catholic president ever elected. And so he decides that he's going to run in the election of 1960. On one side, you got the Republicans running with Richard Nixon, who is the vice president. He is figuring that this is going to be an easy election. He's got more experience. He's also been a judge and served in the armed forces. Kennedy, on the other hand, comes in as a Democrat who's very young, very hungry, and wants to actually change things in America, whereas Nixon's being more reserved about these changes. Now, one thing that helps out Kennedy more than anything else in this election is the television. The TV will be utilized for the first time in American politics on a national level. And as these people get on TV, Nixon and JFK, that is, to give their TV debates, Nixon does not look or appear very healthy. He looks like he's sick. He's constantly sweating. He's constantly making these goofy faces. And JFK is showing that American people, he is built for this. My grandmother was alive when this election happened, and we had an assignment to do when I was in high school to go out, find somebody that voted in this election, and ask them why they voted for him. And my grandmother said, I voted for him because he was so dang good looking. Now, on the other hand, people listening to the radio thought Nixon won. The TV really propelled Kennedy just that extra step in which he needed to win. Now, he's going to run on his program called The New Frontier. He believes that America is on the next step, trending upwards, and needs to take it to a new place. And so he's going to give this speech at the acceptance speech for the Democratic Convention. He will call for an advance in science, space, eliminating prejudice, different things like that. You can kind of think of his speech being the dream that we are trying to reach or have reached in many areas going forward from 1960. Now, as we all know, we have already talked about, he did little for the civil rights for the first 2 years while he was president. and that was because he felt like he didn't have proper support of his party. Later on, he'll just say, "Screw my party. I'm doing what I know is right." Lyndon Baines Johnson will take it even further and get other laws passed. Now, let's talk about JFK and the Cold War. JFK wanted what was known as a flexible response. And the first thing he does is criticize the missile gap, that is, between the United States and the USSR underneath Eisenhower. Eisenhower was trying to de escalate the amount of war products being produced because he was afraid that America was becoming under the arm of the private sector taking over government contracts and pretty much just producing nothing but weapons, and that would drive us into so much debt. In response to that, Khrushchev and the USSR just continued to build their weapons, and this left us at a missile gap. We knew that their missiles were a lot larger in their capacity as far as destruction, but our missiles at the same time were a lot more accurate. Now, he did not want the Cold War to become nothing but military type of tactics. He wanted to develop a new plan for combating communism by any means necessary. This sounds much like the Truman Plan. And it really was. That's all it really was in the end. And underneath that new frontier, he promised to push the space race. Well, in April 1961, the Soviets placed a man into space. This would be the first man to ever go into space. And the Soviets could place a rocket into space with a man inside, and we could barely get something the size of a basketball to go into space. So we were way behind, and Kennedy the next month comes out and says, "We got to close this gap." And he made a promise. He said, by the end of the decade, we will have a man on the moon. And in 1969, unless you're one of these conspiracy theorists, we actually did place a man on the moon. We are the only country to ever do so. Now, we have went back to the moon a few other times, but we realized that there was no real reason to keep on going because the price in terms of oil was astronomical. I mean, you could probably drive around the world in your vehicle if, say, we could have a road that went around the world several times and still not use all the oil that was required in order to get to the moon. Under the JFK administration, we will see the Berlin Wall be constructed. The reason that this wall was constructed was because the United States at that point in time still refused to accept that East Germany was going to have to be communist. And so we allowed over 2.5 million East Germans to flee into this democratic West Germany or West Berlin area. And so these East Germans are trying to flee in this area and they're trying to actually become free. And Khrushchev says, "Fine, then we will build a wall and we will make sure that it's manned militarily, and anybody trying to get caught in that middle area will be gunned down. No questions asked unless you have a pass." And then we have the worst mistake JFK ever did as president, at least when it comes to the Cold War. That is the Bay of Pigs. The Bay of Pigs was a plan originally conducted by the Eisenhower administration. They knew that Castro was going to eventually take power, and he did, and they came up with a plan to overthrow it. This plan was in its final stages, and then Eisenhower's got to go because his time in office, he served his 2 terms, he's done. JFK comes in, and all of a sudden, they hand him this plan. And he's like, "What do you want me to do with this?" And the military says, "We want you to go ahead and force Castro out." And he says, "Well, I don't think this is going to work." And so the military sat down with him, convinced him to do so. The plan was very simple. We would send over a couple of our special operation guys, and they would go in there and they would go ahead and help fund and pretty much give weapons to the people there that were very unhappy. The people in Cuba at that point in time weren't quite unhappy enough with Castro because Castro got rid of the mafia. The mafia abused the Cuban people way more than what Castro does. So they're like, "We're not going to give up Castro, have to go back to the mafia." But in time, they realized the mafia wasn't coming back, Castro was not a good thing, and that the American way was what they really wanted. However, though, it was too late. In the meantime, the president was supposed to send in the Air Force to fly over, bomb key targets, and his Air Force is flying over, and he's asking them and saying, "What do you see? Is there an uprising?" And the Air Force is saying, "No, we see very little action." And so he pretty much pulls the plug on that, says, "Get back home, don't drop any bombs," nothing like that. This was a colossal failure for Kennedy. And you can see the famous political cartoon here. He's smoking a Cuban cigar and it blows up in his face. And so that's going to lead us to the Cuban Missile Crisis. People there in Cuba were crying out and saying, "We need somebody to protect us." And they looked to the Soviets because they were both communist governments. If you're wondering where Cuba is 90 miles directly south of Florida. So they're very close. So we have a communist nation in our own backyard. And that's why they really pushed for the Bay of Pigs to happen. But after the Bay of Pigs, the Cuban Missile Crisis happens, and this is when the Soviets pretty much send the missiles to Cuba to go ahead and set up a bunch of missiles that could launch anywhere in the United States, at least destroy the southern part and the middle part of it, and maybe even some of the northern part. And in return, the Soviets could pretty much destroy the rest of it. And Cuba was very happy about this because they felt like if they had these missiles there, then they would be protected. The United States would not try to mess with them because they were afraid of getting bombed. Now, our U-2 spy planes picked this up and they noticed that they have the missiles, but they do not have the warheads in these missiles. The warheads were still on a ship being sent to Cuba from the Soviet Union, and the United States finds out about this. At that point in time, the United States places a blockade on Cuba, and they tell the Soviet boats, "Go ahead, turn around. If you come over and you try to run through this blockade, it is an act of war. We will respond by bombing you." This happened for 13 days. This was a 13-day face-off between the two superpowers of the world. And in that 13 days, people in America and people in the Soviet Union all panicked. There were times when the Soviets were picking up stuff on the radar, they didn't know what it was, and they were wondering if it's a bomb and they should retaliate. And then there were times in the United States might have done the same thing. Overall, though, eventually Khrushchev and JFK were able to contact each other, work out a deal. The deal was for the United States to pretty much remove some obsolete missile silos in Turkey, and the Soviets would respond by taking out those missile silos in Cuba. The deal worked out. Everything was fine. This was the closest time we ever came to nuclear annihilation on both sides. Good movie to watch on that is 13 Days. It's got some good actors in it. I would love to show it in class if we were in class, but I couldn't because there's a lot of F bombs and things like that dropped in the entire movie. Also, another movie that portrays this, X-Men First Class. If you never watched that part, well, check it out. Some other notable info. We'll probably end here today. JFK realized that he had messed up in Latin America. And so what he's going to do is provide billions of dollars and pledge this money to helping out people in Latin America. He was trying to buy back their goodwill through money because he realized he messed up during the Bay of Pigs. He's also going to go ahead and create what is known as the Peace Corps. Peace Corps is going to allow Americans to go over and serve in a certain area as a doctor, teacher, some kind of demanded role for 24 months. Now, in return, they will get like free training in all this area. So if you want to become a doctor, teacher, or something like that, this was a good way to go about getting that degree for nearly nothing, and then at the same time feel like you've done some good in the world. And then the last thing with JFK. We all know that he gets assassinated, and there's all types of videos, conspiracies, and everything else about it. In the end, the Warren Commission was in charge of investigating the JFK assassination. They state through their documents that JFK was assassinated by Lee Harvey Oswald and he acted all alone. Now, the link over here, I'm going to go ahead and pull it up. You can see it talks about the magic bullet theory. The magic bullet theory basically kind of works like this. You can see him driving, and they're saying there's no way in the world a bullet can pretty much change direction like this bullet is about to change. And the Warren Commission didn't really give out all the information to the American public, showing that that was not the case. That bullet did not travel like that. The bullet did, in fact, go straight like it was supposed to. And so, for so long, so many people thought that the government was covering something up, but they really weren't. They just did not give out this information. These guys were not seated just like you see right here. They were seated more like what you see has been changed there. And so when the bullet passes and it lines up, that bullet never curves, it goes straight, and this debunks a lot of those conspiracy theories, as you can see there. So there are still many of them out there. You can believe whatever you want to believe. I saw an interesting one where he may have been shot by his own Secret Service. Check that one out. All right, and that's it. Take care.